Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yaki Silia, and I'm the chairman of our meeting this morning. So we have a full house, and we will today be speaking on will violence disrupt South Africa's elections. This meeting is being broadcast online, so I'd like to say welcome to our online audience. It also means that the first part of the seminar, until the end of the formal presentations, will be broadcast live. After that, we will go offline and have our discussions under Chatham House rules. We have three speakers today. Before I introduce them, I would firstly like to say thanks to the funders of the Institute that make these events possible, the Hans Heidel Foundation. I see their representative is here, as well as the representatives of the ISS Partnership Forum, the European Union, the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United States of America. Without them, these events would not be possible. Last week, we had a seminar where we looked at possible election results. We hope that by now everybody has forgotten our forecasts. Because the polls are coming in thick and fast, and I don't think ever before in South Africa have the polls been so unrevealing in terms of the disparate results that we could see. So the 8th of May is going to be a very interesting day, and we are waiting with bated breath for the results. But one of the factors clearly that concern many of us is the extent of violence that we could see during these elections. So I think the seminar today is very well timed. And I think it could shed light on what we think could happen in the days ahead. You will all remember with the 2016 local government elections, the extent to which violence, assassinations, and murder preceded those elections, as well as, of course, general violence. So we have three speakers. Our first speaker will be Lisette Lancaster. Lisette is the manager of the, I've got to get the name right here, the Crime and Justice Information Hub, which is the Institute's online data source that maps crime across South Africa. And Lisette has been running a violence tracker for several years. So we track violence in South Africa and report on that. Lisette's going to be the first speaker, speak for about 20 minutes. Then Lauren Tracy, who's a researcher in the Justice and Violence Prevention Program. Lauren, who joined us fresh from maternity leave, actually still on it, is going to speak on research that they did mostly in Gauteng on violence and attitudes. And she will be followed by Lwazi Khoza from the Youth Lab. Youth Lab is a policy think tank in Johannesburg, and engage and work on youth issues. So I think the three speakers are well qualified to speak with us today. I must apologize that the South African Police Service have a security cluster meeting this morning, and unfortunately had to cancel their participation, for which we are sorry, but we hope that they will, in the meanwhile, ensure that we indeed have free, fair, safe elections, and that violence will in actual fact be contained. With that introduction, Lisette, I'm going to ask you then to go first. I assume you're going to speak from the podium, and we look forward to listening to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So, I suppose the question we are all here for is, will violence disrupt South Africa's elections? And to answer that question, I just need to give you some background. So Yaki has spoken kindly of the Crime and Justice Information Hub at the ISS, which we use to provide citizens with the most comprehensive statistics and analysis about crime and safety in the country. And if we can't find it online, if we can't find that type of information from the police or the criminal justice system partners, we try and get it ourselves. And that was the origin of the project, the Protest and Public Violence Monitoring and Mapping Project that we started in 2013. By 2012, we started realizing that crime or public violence associated with protests are on the increase, that more and more arrests are being made, and that there are more protests taking place than had in the previous decade. And we also realized very quickly that we need to track this, because if we don't, we might not really understand what's going on and what people are protesting about, and not just that, but what the actual responses should be to these protests. Right then already we sat with issues of police brutality. We had lots of reports on protesters turning violence and people calling it criminality, and not quite understanding what drives people from a constitutionally mandated right to protest to engaging in violence. But we quickly realized that it's not just protesters that are perpetrating the violence, that there are many factors that play a role in violence becoming almost enabled, or things escalating into violence. What we also realized really quickly was that people don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to protest. Or, even more importantly, people do not wake up one day and say, I will be violent today. That's not how it works in this country. What we do see, if we look at all the over 5,200 cases or incidents that we have monitored since 2013, is that people try and follow all the routes they can in our democratic dispensation to air their grievances about mostly service delivery, but we also see many incidents around crime and violence in communities, not just basic service delivery issues as we see in the popular media, but actually most of the crime or most of the type of protest grievances actually center around crime and violence in this country. And that's really important. We are seeing emerging trends that housing is becoming the issue in metro urban areas. So people don't wake up one day and say, I am going to burn tires and disrupt. People follow the routes of grievance making, speaking to their ward councillors, speaking to the relevant government department, making petitions. But these often fall on deaf ears, or people are told there's no budget, or it will be included in the IDP process, and things escalate, not in days, but in months, in years. And why am I telling you this? This is really important, because the hotspots we see today and the hotspots we see this week and this month and next week didn't arise overnight. They have been persistent across months, years, and therefore we can, to some extent, predict them. Now, we try and monitor as many type of protests and public violence as we can. But one emerging factor, and let me just go back to that slide. You can see, and I'm sorry it's so small, that there are some protest categories there. Now they are just some, or shall I say, we recategorize it into those 20, but we actually have more than that, because people's grievances are widespread and they are multiple. So those are just the main sort of categories we try to engage with. And one of those is election-related violence. Now, this is a really difficult thing to measure. Why do I say that? Because in South Africa, and as I'm going to show you, it actually differs quite substantially from the traditional forms of election violence that you see in other countries, which are conflict of state actors onto citizens, different political parties, and so forth. Not that we don't have those, but here we have an electorate that is making a proactive stand to sometimes disrupt elections. And it's becoming an emerging trend, but I'll also show you one that is not as widespread potentially as we think it is, but one that could become that. So what is election violence? This is a working definition. We've spent a lot of time with lots of people since 2013 and international research to come up with some idea of what we should define as election violence. So yes, it's a form of political violence. We have other forms of political violence outside of electoral processes. We have even political killings, as Yaki alluded to, that often stems from people enforcing or trying to force by-elections or power changes within their local communities. So it becomes quite a widespread thing, but for now we are looking at what type of election-related political violence we are monitoring. And we're looking at threats of coercion, intimidation, and this is quite important, and physical harm. We're also looking at blackmail or abuse of political stakeholders. We are looking at, it can arise from different political views, opinions, or practices. This is the most important point. It's aimed to influence the process of elections, such as a delay, a hindrance, a disruption, or a derailment of a poll, and to influence its outcomes. Now, this is the type of thing we've been seeing during election registration weekends and over the past couple of elections, where people within communities or groups disrupt, blockade, or ensure that the IEC, for instance, cannot open a polling station, or polling stations get burned down, so people cannot either register to vote or vote itself. So the intention here is very much to impact elections. And of course it can be directed against people, places or things, or even data. And as I've alluded to, it can happen during any stage of the electoral cycle. I'll speak about that a bit more. And it doesn't necessarily need to be by the state or political parties. It can also be by individuals or organized groups. So just a quick reference to what the electoral cycle looks like. It is a process that the IEC follows. There are dates attached to all of these, but the ones we are most concerned over, and the ones where we see the most election violence and we actively monitor. So in this case, certain protests we look very closely at and scrutinize to see if there's not an element of political engagement or intention around elections. And that is the electoral campaign process, that purple one, and the voting operations and election day processes by the IEC. And these are the ones where we see a lot of disruption. So it might be traditional campaigning, posters being torn down, two parties campaigning in the same area and conflict emerges. But we haven't seen very much around the other processes. Of course, this often happens, as I said, the political killings around registration and nominations. We saw it in 2016 specifically with the local government elections, when we did see branch meetings ending up in conflict. We did see assassinations. We did see a lot of factional fighting, especially in certain parties. So those processes we try and register, we also try and monitor, but it's often more in retrospect, whereas this first 6 months, almost that pink and purple area, we can really say that it's quite easy to monitor, because you just need to look at the incidents that we find on the media reports quite closely to find any element of campaigning, or often political parties taking up a community issue in order to further their own political ambitions. So there, just a quick reference again. We also try and take into account the Electoral Code of Conduct. Nice little pictures from the IEC, as well as the Electoral Code in types of little beehive blocks. And here I think the most important ones that we have seen is under the ballot box the intimidation of candidates or voters. There are issues around the carrying of firearms at meetings and marches. We've also been seeing the offering of any inducement or reward. We've seen incidents of people complaining that the destroying and removing or defacing of posters of other parties, just generally the abuse of power, and it's always difficult. We often have allegations, especially with the ruling party, not always sure you're using state resources for political campaigning and such. But of course, there's also the bribing of voters to vote or not to vote. Whether food packages and parcels fit into this, I don't know. That's a separate debate. So, we have found since 2013, during the lead up to the 2014 election, and this is available online. You can go to the Crime Hub, you'll find it. You can even click on those little dots and you'll see what the incident is. We have this map, you have various options, is overlaid with the results from the 2014 national elections, so that's the winning wards. So if you zoom in on this map, you can even see who won the ward. So it's always interesting to see what happened in areas and who won the ward. So this is not a very clear map, and I apologize, but I just want to show you when we did a type of heat map analysis of the 2014 incidents, the 6 months leading up, the metros were highlighted. And they were highlighted simply because of the high density, so you had lots of protests together, but also because of the persistence of those protests over time. So over 6 months, some of those areas erupted more than once. But then please take note of the little dots, especially in places like the Eastern Cape. When we did some hotspot analysis after the 2014 election, we tried to overlay, and this is not the best, it's quite crude, but we tried to overlay where these hotspots were in terms of the winning parties. And this is quite interesting because a persistent hotspot, which we have seen again today or this week and in the past month, is Bekkersdal, Kutsong area. Now, there we saw disruptions and people vowing not to vote, and we saw disruptions in all the voter registration weekends. And interestingly, in those areas, the EFF managed to get 12 to 18% of the vote in the most affected areas. And we also estimated that the EFF had a strong showing in many of these hotspots of between 9 and 13% during this time. But if you really look closely, you also see some DA wards emerging, but these hotspots are still majority ANC winning areas. Why? Because very often, number one, it's not the entire community that ever protests. That's something we must remember. Number two, people might still vote one way, but protest to show their grievances aimed at that same ruling party. And thirdly, many of the protesters might not be voting in the first place. And that's really important when we look at the estimates that over 15 million might not be voting in this election. So, where does that bring us? If we look, and it's a pity that the SAPS are not here today. I also wish I could hear the security cluster briefing taking place at this moment. But what we know from 2014 is that the election-related hotspots, security hotspots, weren't always the same as where the protest erupted on the day or the weeks, and the week especially before that. They are often different. And we have seen through various media reports, our own analysis, and a lot of what we've said in the media, that the intelligence capability of the SAPS is quite lacking in many areas, and it's very difficult for them to foresee exactly where all the hotspots will be. What we do know is that very often some of these protests, like the Botshabelo one in the Free State, that was off the radar completely before the election. It was a peaceful protest on the day, but they have protested before. It's not that they came that day and decided to protest. The indications were there early on, and they were persistently protesting, and nobody really took notice. So then people decide to have a national platform to air their grievances. The other thing that we learn is that when we look at 2016, we do see certain persistent hotspots, but we also see a lot of others, especially in places like the Eastern Cape. And that is interesting because we are seeing those same hotspots emerging again, Amatole and areas around Buffalo City, Alfred and Zor, Amatole districts. I mean, there were 56 polling stations in the Eastern Cape that couldn't open on the last voter registration weekend this year because of peaceful protests and disruptions. That's quite significant. So we'll get to why that is. And then just very briefly, because I don't know how much time I've got left, this thing is not telling me, so I was hoping it would, is that when we look at 2019, and this is up to about March, because I'll show you April stuff now. We just, time. April only ended 48 hours ago, basically, or not even, is that we saw over 140 polling stations that couldn't open on the last voter registration weekend on time because of disruptive protests. That's what the ISC told us. When we look at where these are, we saw the 56 in the predominantly rural Eastern Cape. We saw a lot up here, but most importantly, we saw similar trends in 2014 and 2016, namely that there were the burning of certain polling stations, tents, mostly there was the hall in KwaZulu-Natal. And there were more incidents than were recorded in the last voter registration weekend in 2016, which was 92. So now we had 92 disruptions that time, 114 this time. So there seems to be a slight increase if we look at the number of disruptions, if the voter registration weekends are anything to go by. And as I've shown very briefly, admittedly, that these areas are persistent, so if they are likely to flare up on voter registration weekends, they are very likely to flare up during this time. So, where does this leave us? March, we have seen usual suspects erupting, Beckersdale, areas around Tembisa, we have seen Katlehong, we have seen areas around Mamelodi, Tshwane, Alexandra coming in April. The same again, so you can go onto the crime map, put in the right dates, and you'll see these areas. And it's mostly located in the metros for April, as well as some areas in the Eastern Cape, rural areas. Of course, there's been in March a lot of incidents in Limpopo and Mpumalanga. So it's also areas to watch. Okay, so very quickly, just this concluding slide before I just get to a brief analysis, and that is that despite all these alarming points and hotspots and colors, we are estimating that by the sounds of if we have the voter registration weekends to look at, where less than 1% of polling stations were disrupted. We do not anticipate more than 1% to 2% of polling stations disrupted. Now, 2% is really unexpected, but I think we can safely say around 1%, which is higher than previous years. So traditional election violence, the political party, intra-political party, that type of fighting remains minimal, and that's really great. However, we are seeing more protest-based disruptions. And this is important. And what I think we need to really take cognizance of is recent studies by the HSRC, and they really wanted to be here to show their research to you themselves, but they're busy with polling, preparation for the election exit polls, is that when they did studies in 2015 and compared it to their study in 2018, they found that more people believe that protesting in the street is more effective than voting. They also found that it is more acceptable to engage in disruptive protests at voting stations as a way to ensure change. There, the percentage went from 30% in 2015 to 42% that agreed with this in 2018. They also found that more people believe that it's acceptable to engage in violent protests, such as to vandalize voting stations, as a way to effect change rather than voting. That went up from 10% in 2015 to 20% in 2018. What does this mean? It means that, number one, do not say voter apathy is because people are not participating politically. They are. We have a very active political engagement. It might just not be in the forms we would like it to be. However, as I will show now, we still have a 70+% turnout. That's quite remarkable for a country, for any country. So we really need to monitor these hotspots better. But what we know for now is that there is a greater willingness to take up disruptive protesting practice. That there's this entry of newer political parties, and many of them, into traditional strongholds that are causing the potential or the risk of higher conflict. There's greater contestation between parties in the metros because of the difference in the local government being run by a different party to the provinces. We have seen, when we try to find out why after the 2016 elections we are seeing this surge in protests, we realize because existing agreements and task teams broke down because of the disjointed and dysfunctional relationship between province and local government when it came to service delivery. We also saw that there is an increasing feeling of despair when it comes to service delivery, and that government is just not responsive. Hence, some hotspots are persistent, such as Bekkersdal, Alexandra, Tshwane, Fuvani, the list goes on. But what I've also alluded to is that the trend suggests that the practice of the last voter registration weekend is very likely to predict what's going to happen on election day for many of those areas. That many, especially in rural Eastern Cape, for example, and Mpumalanga, many support the political party they are protesting against, and voting for an alternative is not an option. So the alternative to voting for them is protesting on the day. But there's something I'm just watching, and I'm not putting my money on this yet. If the last week was anything to go by, the total Tshwane shutdown movement, there seems to be some protest fatigue entering the fray, and it would be interesting to see how that plays out. So to conclude, this is also another HSRC slide. 2/3 of people are dissatisfied with our democracy. We have to understand that. So it's not surprising that we are seeing an increase in disruptive protests. And this is courtesy of the HSRC, please. I don't want to ever take theirs as ours. But yet people vote. We have to understand that. So, how can we minimize disruptive protests? Well, we get some clues from the World Health Organization work on prevention of violence, and we look at collective violence. And unfortunately for us in this country, we tick basically all the blocks of inequality and growing unevenness, rapid changing demographic characteristics such as rapid urbanization, hence the problem in the metros. A lack of democratic processes, especially corruption. The political instability, well, that is not so much for us, thankfully, but the ethics around certain things, growing disparities and racial segregation that's still prevailing, the deterioration of public services, and severe economic decline. And none of us here can deny that. So we need to address all of this. I don't know how. Thankfully, I'm not the economist and the social expert in all of this, but all of us need to do stuff to work together to get this done. So post-election, politicians and the new administration will need to work hard with the private sector, to not only grow the economy and to decrease unemployment. Because if you look at the grievances, when you look at the descriptions in all these communities, why they don't vote, they say, we don't have basic services, we do not have opportunities, our children are educated but they cannot find work. We really need to address inequality and corruption and improve service delivery. But not just service delivery and water and sanitation, but especially housing and especially safety from our research. And only then will trust be restored in institutions and government. And only then will the youth perception change of democracy. Now, why do I mention the youth perception? Because there are two experts that's going to talk about that. They are the current constituents and the future constituents. And a lot of where this country is going is going to be in their hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lizette. That was fascinating from a variety from a variety of perspectives. I think in terms of shaping the challenges that we face and pointing to what is changing. And I particularly appreciate the point that you make when you make the argument that South Africans are engaged politically. So this issue of political apathy that we often speak about is in actual fact maybe misplaced. So that was concerning, but very, very, very interesting. So, Lauren, you're next. And I think you're going to speak largely about Gauteng.
Yes.
Please.
Morning, everybody. So young people have the ability to fundamentally change the political landscape of South Africa if they decide to use their ballot to hold political parties accountable. However, given the substantial socio-economic challenges that they continue to face, especially after 2 decades of democracy, many young people have become cynical about what's happening in their communities and are increasingly seeing public protest as a viable alternative to get the challenges addressed and to motivate for change in these communities. So this was a significant finding in a previous ISS research study that we conducted in the lead up to the 2014 national elections and the 2016 local government elections. We conducted this research study amongst 2,000 young people across all the 9 provinces of South Africa. They were specifically from tertiary institutions, so we looked at high school students, your FET college or TVET college students, and we also interviewed students in universities. So that study was particularly looking at an age group between 18 to 24 years old. This was important for us because at that time, this was a generation of young people that were the first generation born into a democratic South Africa. We also sought to understand the factors that influence the voting behavior of that young demographic. We wanted to understand what drives those who do engage in voting and what discourages those who do not. So over the last few years, the South African police have recorded an increased number of disruptive and violent protests that have required their intervention. Youth political expression also appears to be gendered in nature. Men or young men are often portrayed in the media to be at the forefront of violent protests, whereas there is greater voter participation amongst young women. So this was important for us in conducting this research study. we wanted to understand what the gendered nature of young people's political participation was. So the aim of this research study was to gain an understanding, as I've stated, of the gendered nature of young people's political participation. We did this by obtaining qualitative evidence on the experiences, perceptions, and motivations of young males and females that resulted in their preference for disruptive politics as opposed to participation in formal democratic mechanisms. So we felt this was needed in the lead up to the 2019 national elections to inform appropriate policy responses and recommendations that would allow for the reduction of violence and to promote democratic engagement. So just a bit on the methodology that we used. We conducted 12 focus groups, and in-depth analysis was done through 120 one-on-one interviews across 6 communities identified as having high levels of public and collective violence. So these communities included Meadowlands, Attridgeville, Actonville, Kwatemba, Katlehong, and Eldorado Park, and they're marked on the map over there. We identified these communities through data collected by our ISS protest and public violence monitoring tool, which Lizette has just explained. So we specifically selected hotspots based on our monitoring tool, and that's the communities that we went into to conduct this research study. So during the study, we directly engaged 209 young people between the ages of 18 and 29 years old. Every effort was made to ensure that at least 50% of the respondents were young women, which we managed to achieve quite closely. Quota sampling was used to identify and recruit a mixture of young people between that age group, so your 18 to 29-year-olds, not only by gender, but also by age, with the bulk of our respondents coming from your 20 to 29-year-old category. Race, with the bulk of our respondents coming from or being black, followed by colored and Indian. And employment status, where we managed to get a fairly close breakdown of employed, unemployed, and students participating from the different communities that we went into. So the participants were recruited with the help of an experienced partner and a community-based organization known as Papama Initiatives. They have a community-based footprint and access to a constituency of youth groups in all the 6 communities. So this allowed us to get a good random sampling of the youth in those communities. So our findings indicate that young people feel silenced and absent from formal democratic processes, and that protests give them the visibility and acknowledgement that they need. Much like our earlier research study, young people continue to be frustrated by high rates of youth unemployment and the lack of access to higher education. The responses of young women in this study illustrate that they're still at the periphery when it comes to meaningful economic and political change, or power, shall I say, while the young men demonstrate how violence has become normalized in their communities, with some seeing it as the best way to resolve conflict. The perceived unresponsiveness of local leaders in addressing the concerns of the community also plays a key role in why young people tend to engage more in protest action and would rather take that as a form to air their grievances as opposed to going to the polls and voting. Our findings also indicate that there's a clear need for a more competitive party system, and that the current quality of political parties in South Africa is lacking and failing to attract disgruntled voters. So in 2014, South Africa's national elections, so in the 2014 South African national elections, young people between the ages of 18 to 29 years old made up 10.9 million of the eligible voting age population. Of this number, only 6.4 million, or 58%, in 2014 actually registered to vote. As part of this research study, we wanted to identify the factors that affect youth voter turnout in previous elections. So while there's still a clear acknowledgement among the participants in this research study around the importance of voting in South Africa, little has changed in this regard, particularly around their perceptions of effectiveness and the effectiveness of voting particularly. So during our discussions, it was clear that young people still feel marginalized from formal democratic platforms. They're also generally quite despondent about democratic processes such as the elections and struggle to identify the process as something that would bring about change in their communities and improve livelihood opportunities. Their frustrations around issues of unemployment and the need for free quality higher education was still evident throughout the interviews. This, along with the unresponsiveness of the local leaders, was often mentioned as some of the key reasons that deter young people from taking to the polls and voting come election day. During our interviews, young people highlighted that they would withdraw from voting altogether if the promises made by politicians do not materialize, rather than shifting their vote to another political party. This speaks to the potential and quality of competitive party politics in South Africa. Something that's not highlighted on the slide here, but that is important to mention, is the role that the family plays in urging young people to go to the polls and vote come election day. In 2019, tapping into the potential of the youth vote will be especially crucial for political parties, as this demographic will make up a substantial proportion of the eligible voting age population. So in March 2018, the IEC held its first voter registration. 2.7 million voters responded to the call to register or update their registration details. Of the new votes registered, 82% were under the age of 30, and about 54% were women. As of November 2018, just over 26 million citizens had registered for the 2019 national elections. Of this, 5.2 million were between the ages of 18 and 19 years old. So understanding whether these figures were a true reflection of young people's intention or are a true reflection of young people's intention to vote come 2019 was a very important factor for this research study. It must be noted now, though, we now see that young people, following the final registration weekend in January, were once again seen to have a worrying drop in their registration levels. Between your 18 to 19-year-olds, there was at least a 47% registered, and amongst your 20 to 29, 9% drop was evident in that age category. So the majority of young respondents in this research study said that they would be voting come 2019, which this slide highlights, and it sort of demonstrates some of the reasons behind why they said they would be voting come 2019. During these discussions, it was clear that the change in leadership within the ruling party and the popularity of President Cyril Ramaphosa has created a sense of optimism amongst these young people, and that this could be an attracting feature not only for the political party and its declining voter base, but the youth as well. They mentioned that they want their voices to be heard by political leaders, and that 2019 would allow them to raise their voices and demand change. Where trust in institutions is concerned, most young people responded that they did trust the IEC and the way in which it ran elections, although there wasn't always a good understanding of exactly what the role of the IEC is amongst these young respondents. While a few felt that the IEC could not be trusted, citing issues of corruption within the organization, concerns around ballot papers going missing, and failing to see the IEC as an independent organization free from political interference. I think that's important for us to note when we sort of have a discussion around it. During the discussions, the participants also demonstrated a clear lack of trust in the police. And again, it's a pity we couldn't have a representative from the police here. In this research study, police were often perceived as corrupt and taking part in the looting during protests. They were also often seen as working with and being on the payroll of drug dealers in some of the communities that we went into, particularly communities such as Eldorado Park, Meadowlands, Katlehong, and Actonville, where drug abuse was brought up as a key concern and as something that makes young people violent and allows them to act with reckless abandonment when there's a protest within the community. So what drives young South Africans to protest or not? So the need for change was highlighted as a key factor in their discussions, change in their livelihoods around issues of service delivery. This slide also highlights a few of the other comments or pointers or frustrations that came about during our discussions with young people. Concerns around the inefficiency of local government in addressing their demands were often raised in the study. Interestingly, however, is that during our discussions, young people illustrated that engaging in protest is a result of a lack of responsiveness from those with the authority to address their grievances. So these young people commonly mentioned the steps they would take before even considering taking part in a protest. First of which would be approaching their local ward councillors or a community leader, someone within the community, about the concerns that they faced and would like addressed. In cases where this approach failed, they would then resort to protesting. In exploring the gender differences regarding young males and young females' engagement in protests, young women were often identified as only engaging in protests that revolved around issues of rape and abuse, the well-being of children, housing, and concerns of safety. This view was slightly more prevalent amongst the young males, which was interesting. Whereas young males were identified as more likely to be violent and often engaging in protests to commit crime, to loot foreign-owned stores, and to destroy property. This was mentioned by both males and females. Young women in our research study were also often more critical about the way in which young males would approach getting something done in the community. And these are just a few of the comments that I've put up here that you can have a read through. So in as much as they acknowledge the role that men played, or the role that men played within the community, men would acknowledge the role of women as thinkers, the calmer individuals who didn't like violence. Young people largely agreed that there is a relationship between voting and protests, which is evident by the slide. I mean, there was a majority of the young people that we spoke to felt that there is this link between those who go out and vote and those who engage in protests. They often mention that those who go out and vote are the very same individuals who are engaging in protests, and it's only as a result of their grievances not being addressed through voting or formal democratic processes that they then decide to take to the streets in protest. Our research demonstrates that young people respond well to being invited and participated in political discussions, and I guess this speaks to what Lizette said as well, the idea that youth are apathetic, that they are not engaging politically. Our research studies, not just this research study, but previous research studies have sort of almost debunked this myth. Young people want to be included and engaged at a political level. Their silencing on formal democratic platforms is what drives them to engage in protests. There's a need for the IEC to evaluate their national communication and education campaigns. And this came out quite strongly during our discussions, particularly in describing the inner workings of the organization, such as the vote counting process, which a lot of the young people that we spoke to often felt was rigged, that there was no transparency during a very crucial part of the voting process. Civil society, the IEC, and the police need to make young people aware of their rights and responsibilities regarding protests and demonstrations, as well as the consequences attached to using violence during such activity. There was often during our discussions a sense that the police need to engage the community a bit more, that they were seen as a body that needs to come to the fore in trying to understand what the reason behind the protest is before just actively coming in with, whether it's rubber bullets or whatever the case may be, to try and subdue the crowd. The normalization amongst this young group also demonstrated the importance of violence prevention initiatives being a priority not for adults, but also for children and youth of all ages. There's a clear indication that young people are fed up with waiting for change to occur. Change for this demographic seems to be happening far too slowly. As a result, an almost immediate response from, or the lack of response from political leaders has resulted in them almost immediately following that with a protest, be it a violent or a non-violent protest, and they see this as a more effective way of engaging politically. So I'm going to end off with a short little video that we launched following this research study.
Thank you very much, Lauren. There was clearly a lot of overlap and synergy between your two presentations, and I think it's the one underpins and accentuates the other. So thank you very much. Lwazi Khoza from the Youth Lab, we're now going to listen to your analysis.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to first give my thanks to Lizette and her team for the invite. I am Lwazi Khoza, current politics and international relations student at Wits University, is currently doing her final year, who also just so happens to work for a very phenomenal institution called Youth Lab. So today I'm here to give a youth perspective in terms of political participation and where we are in this country as young people. What Youth Lab did last year was we went around having consultations in the entire country because we wanted to do our research for this piece of work over here called the South African Youth Manifesto. Mine is very tattered because it has been my bread and butter for the past 4 months. We've basically gone around the country, had consultations with various young people from various spheres and sectors, and trying to understand where they are in terms of awareness and readiness leading into these elections. And what we then did with this information was we handed it over to members of parliament of respective political parties. Last year we had the launch in November, so that by the time they lead into their own political party manifesto drafting, the word of young people is prevailing, hopefully. We've hoped that they've listened to us. So part of the work that we did was we had to ask questions. We had to ask questions about whether or not young people know how the system of voting happens in this country, whether or not their understanding of the system of democracy. I'm so sorry. I don't understand why understanding is two separate words. But anyway, whether or not their understanding of the system of democracy in this country, and these are the questions that were asked. Have they voted in the elections? Do they understand what proportional representation means, direct representation? Because we know that there are various electoral processes that take place in the world, and South Africa currently has a proportional representation system where people don't necessarily vote for an individual, but they vote for the party, and the election of that individual has got very little to do with the greater electorate. So it's as though what happens internally then dictates what happens to the rest of the country. And are young people aware of that? Are they aware that seeing Cyril's face on a poster had to happen after Nasrec and so we just wanted to gauge the state of readiness and understanding of where young people are in terms of political participation in this country. And so we asked these questions, and they had to basically answer in 3 forms, which was either they agree, they disagree, or they're absolutely unsure about the question and what it absolutely meant. And there are 2 questions that really stood out, and that was question 5, if you look back, sorry, I can go back to the previous slide, that said, I'm a member of a political party. And there's not many people who are actually members of political parties. It's 54% of young people that we interviewed and basically had carried out the survey with that are not members of political parties. But then question 11, where we asked the question, I would like to run for office, there was 58% of young people who would like to run for office, meaning that there's a great disjuncture between the understanding of how the system actually works, because you have to go through the political party system, you have to be a member and contest within the party to then contest national elections or provincial elections or hold some form of state power. And there's a genuine mismatch and not understanding of how systems and bureaucracies work within this country, and that is greatly problematic because that then results in young people organizing themselves in other ways or another, and that then leads to protest and such movements. So, as I stated, there is one, the desire to occupy office and serve this country, but two, the observation of not subscribing to what the political norm is. And the political norm, as I said prior, is how you're going to contest power internally to then contest power externally. So young people are actually organizing themselves outside of political parties because maybe one, they could not be subscribing to what the political parties' ideologies are, or two, the political parties are not attractive to young people. And the next slide actually will probably give perspective as to why political parties are currently not attractive to young people. Parliament today, as it sits, has got 24 out of 400 members of parliament that are young. That is a 6% youth representation, which is actually illegal. According to the law, youth representation should be sitting at 40%. Parliamentary legislation says that there should be a 40% young people representation, and we're currently sitting at 6. The ANC has one young person who's actually turned 36, who was Tisni Mutara, so she does not qualify anymore. The EFF has 3, the DA has 3, the IFP has 1, which is Mkhuleko Hlengwa, and he is turning, I think, 34 this year, so next statistics, he's out. So young people are really just saying, nothing for us without us. Young people are tired of legitimizing the process of an ordinary functioning democracy when it is constantly excluding them. I mean, if you, the other numbers that aren't reflecting here are probably MPLs and young people who are sitting at the bottom of the list who really aren't sitting at the big tables and making the big decisions, and they're therefore not as influential as what should be. So protest then becomes, if I'm a young person who wants to participate in this country's democratic processes, it becomes very difficult for me to even see some form of hope as a young person because the system is not reflective of me. Every day you walk in, you watch parliamentary news, and it's post-retirement, and you ask yourself, then what about me? Where does my voice get heard? Where do I then vocalize all that I want to vocalize? Because if I am to subscribe to a political party, and if I am to do things in the ordinary manner of basically what political participation is in this country, the likelihood is that I will get pacified. And another thing is I'll speak from a perspective of being a young black African. There's great respectability politics at play. I cannot say certain things to an elder that I would wish to say because of my position in society. I'm perceived as young. I'm going to be pacified. I'm going to be told, no, you're this, you're that, so you can't speak on certain issues. And so the whole conversation around youth representation is one that actually really needs to be taken into consideration leading into these elections, and I really hope that post-election results, whoever takes on state power, I think it's going to be President Cyril Ramaphosa, appoints young MPs, appoints young ministers, appoints young people in order for young people to actually believe that the democratic system that is currently in place is working and is operational, so that they don't have to resort to protest in order for them to be able to speak truth to power, because they'll then have those channels opened up to them. Protest action is a form of political participation. The idea of disrupting the order of the day has always been one that dawns on a lot of people in terms of disgruntlement and protest. It cannot be, so people believe that it cannot be that their lives are put on hold because of a particular violation of their human rights, and someone else's life can continue ordinarily so, without any hindrance. So, and I'm from the Fees Must Fall generation, so when we took on the streets, we marched to several key points in Johannesburg. The main agenda was, if South Africa is for all that lives in it, our lives are put on hold because we cannot afford education. Education is said to be a human right. Why is it that someone else can have their life fully functioning without any disruption? So disrupting the order of the day, I've always said, has got two elements to it, right? Sometimes you disrupt the order of the day in order for you to gain public sympathy, right? People don't know what happens behind certain walls. I would not have known what happens in Alexander because I don't live in Alexander. But the moment they took the streets and they were protesting for housing, and it didn't make sense to me how across the road there's a 280 million rand building rent that is being paid by Discovery. Quite questionable, right? That some societies are fully functioning whilst others are being held at ransom because of whatever prehistoric reason that exists. The confrontation of privilege is one that also exists. People protest because they believe that they have not been afforded the better end of life. Violence versus violation. So I've always said, when looking at, I think it was Lizette that spoke about the lack of democratic processes, and looking at, I think, the World Health Organization. The violation of human rights is something that people protest about. So if we're ever going to question reasoning behind protests, do we look at violence that is displayed during protest, or do we look at the violation of the human right, and which one do we value more? And I always bring this back to protests that have happened. If you're looking, the Northwest was the case of Understanding dying of rubber bullets, and they were protesting for water. If I'm an individual and I can't live without basic H2O and I die because of rubber bullets, what does the state value more? Are we valuing buildings? Are we valuing systems that are still exclusionary of others, or are we valuing human life? And that is a conversation that still needs to be had today. And then Fees Must Fall in Alexander, I think I've alluded quite a lot on those two major protests that have took place within the country. And right now, South Africa is in a very peculiar state, I think, because young people, there's two versions of young people. So there's the scattered youth vote and there's the stay away voter. And young people today are so misinformed, they're so uninformed, they're so misinformed that young people are not currently coming in one accord. I don't think there's been any clear vision from young people saying that we are voting for this party because this party is this. I always say it's as though between ourselves we're disjunctured as well, and so whoever can convince me best that they're suited for me, I will take that. So it's basically like bargaining and getting the better devil out of the equation given to you. So there's not one clear, young people are not coming together in one clear accord. And that has been a result of protests that have been led by young people. If you're looking at the Fees Must Fall collective, a lot of those young people are headed to Parliament. And the great worry is, as a young person, if you're headed to Parliament, are you still going to let the view of the young person prevail, or are you going to get swamped into the system as well? And the question also becomes, there were so many of us in the struggle. Why did they choose you? How did they choose you? How did they drive to it being you? So the notion of selling out, the notion of young people not being represented by the young people that are placed forth by political parties is the reason why a lot of young people today aren't coming together in one accord, and they have a very scattered vote. Then there's the stay away voter who really just believes, I am not going to participate, I am not going to vote, because they feel as though they don't want to legitimize an activity that has already excluded them so many times over. So if let's say 68% of young people come out and vote, and Parliament statistics still remain the same, are there going to be the same people to come out and say, we want young people in Parliament, when they voted in the previous elections knowing very well that the members of Parliament proposed by political parties were not young? So a lot of young people have decided to stay away from these elections because they do not want to legitimize a process that has already excluded them so many times in the past. And the question of violence leading into these elections, I personally do not think that there will be much. However, Lizette's statistics are quite shocking, I must say. But also, I think I do speak from a position of privilege and living behind high walls. And leading into these elections, I just hope that every stakeholder within the room has a certain level of understanding of other people's disgruntlements. And the role of the media within these elections is to point out the reasoning behind protest instead of the aftermath of protest, because I've always said that there's lack of understanding of the reasoning behind why people protest, because of the manner in which protests are framed. Back to the Fees Must Fall, I'll always refer to what I've gone through. We were told that we are vandalizing buildings, but buildings have got insurance. So we're putting to practice what is there. Like, don't judge us. This is how we're framing our frustration. So I just hope that every South African leading into these elections is fully aware of the fact that this is quite an interesting time that we're leading into. But just be 10 times more sympathetic of people that are actually disgruntled with the manner in which things are happening, because things can't continue to be normal when other people are living in gross abnormalities. And thank you very much. The end.
Thank you very much, Kosi. That was very interesting. I think the one thing that runs across the three presentations is sort of this slow delegitimization of the political process, which I think is a cause of concern for all of us that are concerned about what is happening politically. I think at this point we are going to say goodbye to our online audience, and we will then move into a Chatham House question and answer session. So we'll then be able to speak freely to one another. So thank you very much to the online audience that have attended, and we will then proceed with the discussion.